Ashes of yesterday. The prairie stretched wide beneath a bleeding sky. Two suns dipped low, painting the horizon in colors too vivid to belong to Earth. The wind carried dust and ash, whispering through the charred remains of a cabin that had once been a home. Abigail Reed sat on the porch steps, or what was left of them, with her shawl wrapped tight against the evening chill. Her eyes didn't see the stars winking awake overhead. They were fixed on the broken fence line where raiders had come months ago, sweeping through like a plague of fire. Her husband had stood in that yard with his old hunting rifle, shouting for her to get inside, to take their boy and hide. She had listened, and by listening she had lived. Her family hadn't. She had been alive ever since, but not living. Just breathing. Just remembering. The creak of leather and the steady rhythm of hooves broke the silence. Abigail stiffened, fingers curling instinctively toward the knife at her belt. A rider emerged from the haze of dust. A tall man, broad-shouldered, dressed in a long duster that looked older than the colony itself. He rode not a speeder bike or armored crawler like most men these days, but a horse. A real horse, dark brown and muscled, its breath steaming in the cooling air. The rider drew rein a few yards away. His face was shadowed beneath the wide brim of a hat, but his voice carried warm and even. "Ma'am." Abigail narrowed her eyes. "Keep ridin'. Nothing here for you." He didn't move, just studied her, like a man weighing a poker hand. "Name's Ethan Cade. Passed through this way a few months back. Heard what happened." His gaze flicked to the blackened beams behind her. "Hell of a thing." Her jaw tightened. "You heard right. Now move along." Instead of obeying, Ethan swung down from the saddle. Dust clung to his boots as he approached, slow, deliberate, as if not to spook her. "Wasn't planning to stay long. Just thought I'd offer a hand. You got good land here, water access. Be ashamed to let it go to waste." Abigail laughed once, sharp and bitter. "A shame? Mister, this land cost me everything. My husband, my boy. You think I care if it rots?" The words cracked in her throat, but she forced them out. She wanted him to feel the weight of them, wanted him gone. But Ethan didn't flinch. He looked at her the way men look at storms, respectful, steady, unwilling to back down. "Loss like that," he said quietly, "cuts deep. I know." Her hand trembled around the knife hilt. "Don't you dare pretend. I buried a brother on Jericho's moon," Ethan interrupted, his tone flat, not cruel. "Raiders hit us same way. Took everything but the shirt on my back and the horse under me. Only reason I'm standin' here is because I kept movin'. You sit still too long. The grief leads you alive." Abigail's chest rose and fell, each breath jagged. His words slid under her defenses, not because they were kind, but because they rang true. She hated that truth. "I can't," she whispered, shaking her head. "I can't go through that again." Ethan stopped a pace away. The wind stirred his coat, carried the faint scent of gun oil and leather. His voice, when it came, was softer than the wind itself. "Then let's face it together." The words lingered in the air between them. No promise of safety, no lies about what might come. Just a simple truth, an offer of solidarity. Abigail's eyes burned, and she turned away, staring at the horizon where the suns bled out their last light. Part of her wanted to scream at him to leave. Another part, the part that still dreamed when she let herself sleep, wanted to believe him. She rose slowly from the porch, straightening her shawl. "You want to work the land," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Fine, but don't think it makes us partners. Don't think it makes us friends." Ethan gave the barest hint of a smile. "Wouldn't dream of it." But as he led his horse toward the broken corral, Abigail knew better. Whether she liked it or not, a crack had formed in the walls she had built around her grief. And through that crack, light was creeping in. The sun set, and for the first time in months, Abigail Reed didn't feel entirely alone. Frontier shadows. The days that followed were filled with the kind of work Abigail hadn't touched since before the raid. At first, she told herself she was only letting Ethan stay until he grew tired of repairing fences and mending soil. But each morning when she rose, he was already outside, sleeves rolled, calloused hands steady on whatever tool he had managed to salvage from the ruins. The sound of a hammer striking metal rang across the land, startling in its normalcy. Abigail found herself listening to it the way she once listened to her son's laughter, like a promise that life might still exist here. She told herself she wouldn't get used to it. By the third day, the corral stood straight again, patched with sheets of scrap starship plating Ethan had scavenged from a derelict nearby. "Not pretty," he said, brushing sweat from his brow, "but solid. Raiders won't break through this easy." Abigail had wanted to snap back that nothing was raider-proof. Instead, she caught herself watching the way he leaned on the hammer, the set of his shoulders, like a man carrying invisible weight but refusing to bend. That night, they ate together for the first time. Abigail had cooked a simple stew from ration powder and root vegetables. She hadn't meant to share, but Ethan was sitting out on the porch anyway, and something about his quiet presence had made her ladle a second bowl. "You cook better than any mess hall I ever ate in," he said between mouthfuls. She arched a brow. "That's a low bar, Mr. Cade." He chuckled, and the sound surprised her. Not because it was out of place, but because she realized she hadn't heard laughter in her home since before. The settlement lay 15 miles to the east, and once a week Ethan insisted they ride in. Abigail resisted at first. She hadn't spoken to anyone beyond her land since the raid. But he reminded her that isolation was no shield, only a slower death. The settlement was a scatter of cabins and prefab shelters huddled along a ridge. Children played near solar wells, and traders haggled over spare parts like they were gold. It should have felt comforting, but Abigail's stomach knotted as eyes turned her way. People remembered what had happened. Pity weighed heavier than grief. She would have turned back if Ethan hadn't placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "They're glad to see you," he murmured. "Glad you're still here." At the town's edge, settlers gathered for a meeting. A scout had returned with grim news. The raiders weren't finished. They were regrouping, bigger this time, with stolen war machines in tow. Fear rippled through the crowd. Some argued for running, scattering into the wilderness. Others demanded weapons, fortifications, a fight. Abigail felt her chest tighten. The words, the panic, it all dragged her back to the night of fire and loss. Her breath quickened, and she turned to leave, but Ethan spoke up. His voice carried, calm and strong. "You scatter, you'll be picked off one by one. You fight, you might just give Emma reason to leave the sector for good. It's your choice, but I've seen what happens when people run." The settlers murmured, swayed by his confidence. Abigail's gaze fixed on him, a strange mix of anger and awe. He spoke as if fear had no hold on him, as if he had chosen survival long ago and never looked back. On the ride home, silence stretched between them until she finally broke it. "Why do you care? This isn't your land. Not your people." Ethan looked out at the twin moons climbing the sky. "Because I'm human. That's reason enough. We stick together, or we don't make it at all." His words lingered long after they returned to the cabin. That night, Abigail lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling beams. She told herself she couldn't afford to feel anything for him, for the settlement, for anyone. But she remembered the way his hand had steadied her in the crowd, the way his words had silenced fear. For the first time since the raid, she wondered if maybe survival wasn't about enduring alone. Maybe it was about finding someone stubborn enough to face the storm beside you. She turned on her side, pulling the thin blanket tighter. Tomorrow would bring more work, more repairs, more whispers of coming danger. But for tonight, the farmhouse no longer felt like a tomb. It felt, in the faintest measure, like a home. Fire and blood. The night smelled of smoke before the first alarm was raised. Abigail bolted upright in her bed, heart pounding. For a heartbeat, she thought it was only memory, the nightmare that returned again and again. But then came the sound she feared most, distant shouting, the shriek of warning horns, and the unmistakable crack of gunfire rolling across the plains. Her door burst open. Ethan stood framed in moonlight, revolver already strapped to his hip. "They're here." Abigail's chest seized. Her body wanted to collapse, to curl into the same helpless ball she had been when her world burned. But Ethan's eyes held hers, calm, steady, like iron forged against fire. "You don't have to fight," he said, voice low but firm. "But you can't freeze. Not tonight." The cabin trembled as an explosion ripped through the distant settlement. Abigail forced her legs to move, snatching her shawl and the small rifle Ethan had pressed into her hands days earlier. It felt too heavy, too final, but she gripped it anyway. The settlement was chaos when they reached it. Raiders poured in from the ridge, hulking figures in jagged armor, their stolen war machines firing streams of plasma into homes. Screams cut through the night, children crying as parents dragged them toward cover. Abigail's knees weakened. The flames, the terror, it was her nightmare reborn. Her breath quickened, throat closing. She heard her son scream in the crackle of fire, saw her husband's body in every settler that fell. "I can't," she whispered, stumbling back. Ethan caught her arm, pulling her into the shadow of a half-collapsed barn. His face was close, eyes burning with determination. "You can. Look at me, Abigail. Not the past. Look at me." She did, and something in his gaze anchored her. He wasn't offering safety. He was offering his presence, unshakable, unbreakable. "Not alone this time," he said. The words struck like a spark against tinder. Abigail's breath steadied. Her grip on the rifle tightened. She nodded. Together they fought. Ethan moved with the precision of a soldier, firing clean shots that dropped raiders one after another. Abigail followed his lead, at first clumsy, shaking, but growing steadier with each pull of the trigger. When a raider charged, she fired point-blank, the recoil bruising her shoulder. The man fell, and for the first time in months she felt something stronger than fear, fury. They pushed toward the heart of the settlement where settlers had gathered, forming a desperate line. Ethan barked orders, rallying them to use terrain and fire as weapons, herding raiders into narrow alleys, collapsing makeshift barriers onto their war machines. The settlers obeyed, their terror hardening into resolve. Abigail spotted a small child trapped inside a burning shelter, flames licking higher with each gust of wind. For a heartbeat she froze, her boy's face superimposed over the child's. Then Ethan's words echoed again, not alone this time. She ran. Smoke clawed at her lungs, heat searing her skin as she dragged the child out. The girl clung to her, sobbing, and Abigail carried her into the night air, tears burning her own eyes. "Good," Ethan shouted over the chaos as he saw her. "Damn good." The tide began to turn. Raiders who had come expecting frightened settlers found instead a wall of resistance, every shot fired with the desperation of people who refused to die twice. Improvised explosives disabled 2 of their stolen machines, sending fireballs into the sky. One raider broke through the line and lunged for Ethan. Abigail didn't think. She fired. The raider collapsed at Ethan's feet. Her hands trembled, but her aim had been true. Ethan gave her a grim nod of thanks before turning back to the fight. At last, as dawn broke pale and cold over the horizon, the raiders retreated. They left behind wreckage, bodies, and silence broken only by the ragged breaths of survivors. Abigail stood among the ashes, rifle still clutched in her hands. Her body shook, not from fear but from the flood of adrenaline leaving her veins. Ethan approached, blood streaked across his cheek, coat torn. "You did it," he said simply. She swallowed hard. "We did it." For the first time, she allowed herself to look at him without the barrier of grief between them. He had stood beside her when she faltered, and because of him, she had found her strength again. Her heart still ached with loss, but now it beat with something new, something alive. Together, morning light broke soft and pale across the settlement, revealing the cost of the night. Homes stood in blackened skeletons, fields smoldered with smoke, and the once bustling square was littered with broken machines and still bodies. The air smelled of ash and victory, bitter but real. Abigail stood with her shawl pulled tight, watching as survivors moved among the ruins. They carried buckets of water, lifted beams, tended the wounded. She expected to feel the same hollowness as always, the same certainty that nothing she built could last. But instead she felt something else, the weight of survival, heavy and fierce. Ethan approached from behind, his steps dragging with exhaustion. His duster was torn, one sleeve scorched black. He had fought like a man with nothing to lose, and yet here he was, alive, standing, his eyes still steady. "You should sit," Abigail said, voice gentler than she intended. Ethan gave a tired half-smile. "Don't worry, I'll fall over soon enough." Despite herself, she smiled back. It startled her, the way it came so easily, so naturally, as if some part of her had been waiting for it. By midday, the settlers gathered in the square. Faces drawn and weary, but not broken. They looked to Ethan, and to her, in a way that made Abigail's throat tighten. These people were alive because they had chosen to stand, because she had chosen to stand with them. A man named Harlan spoke first, his voice hoarse. If Cade hadn't led us, we'd all be ash. And if Abigail Reed hadn't stepped in, we'd have lost half our children. We owe them both. Abigail shifted uneasily under the stairs. She wasn't used to being seen as anything but broken. Ethan stepped forward, sparing her. You don't owe us a damn thing, he said. What you did last night, you owe that to yourselves. Raiders thought you'd roll over. They were wrong. You fought, and you won. Remember that. The settlers murmured in agreement, strength flickering in their tired eyes. Abigail looked at Ethan, then truly looked. He had given them more than strategy or firepower. He had given them back belief. And she realized she wasn't the only one who had been saved last night. Later, as the settlement worked, Abigail found herself back at the edge of her land. The corral stood patched and solid, the field scarred but recoverable. She traced a finger along the fence post, remembering her husband's calloused hands fixing it once, her son chasing a ball of cloth nearby. The grief still cut deep, but for the first time it wasn't all she felt. Ethan joined her, leaning against the post with the ease of a man who belonged wherever he stood. You're thinking about leaving, he said quietly. She shook her head. No, I'm thinking about staying. He tilted his hat back, watching her carefully. I was right before, she admitted, her voice raw. I couldn't go through that again. The fire, the loss. I thought it would kill me. She turned to him, eyes shining. But I didn't. Not this time. Because I wasn't alone. For a long moment they stood in silence, the wind carrying only the rustle of scorched grass. Then Ethan reached out, slow and steady, and took her hand. Together, then, he whispered. She let out a shaky laugh. Together. That evening, the settlers lit lanterns along the ridge. Not for mourning, but for defiance, a signal to the dark horizon that humanity still stood here. Children laughed as they chased fireflies between the lights, and Abigail felt her chest swell with something she thought she'd buried forever. Hope. She sat beside Ethan on the porch of her rebuilt home. The stars stretched wide above them, strange constellations she was still learning to name. For the first time in a long while, she wanted to learn them. You really think they'll come back? She asked. Ethan sipped from a battered flask, gaze never leaving the sky. Raiders always come back. Trouble always does. But so do we. Abigail nodded, her hand still in his. The fear wasn't gone, it never would be. But it no longer owned her. The frontier was unforgiving, but she had learned something last night. So was she. As the lanterns flickered, she whispered the words that had haunted her since the day she lost everything. I was right. I couldn't go through that again. Ethan squeezed her hand, his voice low and certain. And you didn't. We went through it. The stars above burned bright, and for the first time since the world fell apart, Abigail Reed felt the future waiting. Not as a threat, but as a promise. Together,